Welcome to the Unhurried Living Podcast. We're sharing leadership conversations to help you develop unhurried rhythms of rest and work. We're helping you overcome hurry and make time for what matters most. And now, enjoy today's episode. Hey friends, welcome to episode 251 of the podcast. My name's Alan, and I'm so glad you've joined me here. I'm hopeful that our time together will help you rediscover an unhurried way of life and leadership. Today, I get to share with you a conversation with a friend and fellow author, David Zailer. His latest book, Death of a Fisherman, is a very honest, personal story. I was honored to write an endorsement for the book, which went like this: honest stories, well told, help us walk our own lives in truth. Real stories of embracing grace show us the way to grow in grace ourselves. David has told a story that is full of both grace and truth. I highly recommend it. Let me share a little bit about David. He is an author, speaker, and founder of Operation Integrity. He is also on the faculty of the Leadership Institute, championing faith-based recovery internationally. His current book is Death of a Fisherman, a memoir of family, faith, and forgiveness. His previous books include Our Journey Home, When Lost Men Come Home, and Starting Point for Recovery. David lives in Laguna Niguel, California, where he is active in his community and enjoys running and cycling. If you're a new listener, welcome to the podcast. If you find these episodes helpful, would you please follow, rate, and review? And be sure to share this podcast with your friends. Now, let's dive into my conversation with David Zailer. On today's Unhurried Living podcast, I'm pleased to have David Zailer, author of the memoir, Death of a Fisherman. Thanks, David, for joining me for this conversation.
Well, thank you, Alan. Thank you for having me. It's always a delight to see you and spend some time.
Well, I'm so glad we're friends, and I'm really glad I get a chance to talk about this latest book of yours. And I always love to start these conversations, but just asking if you can share a little bit of the story of how you came to write this book.
Well, I can't say it was an accident, but it really wasn't my idea. I was having coffee with our mutual friend, Joey O'Connor.
Yeah.
And he says, "Hey, why don't you write a memoir?" I think at that point, I gave him a dirty look. I said, why in the world would I want to do that? But the previous year, I had been traveling back and forth to Houston, which is my hometown.
Yeah.
And my parents are buried there. And I had made the decision that while I was doing my work there, that I was going to go to the cemetery where they were buried and visit their gravesite every day. And so I did that. So over the course of a year, I probably went to the gravesite probably 25 times.
Yeah.
While either at the gravesite, like I met a gravedigger, and he befriended me. And then at the flower store, went to buy some flowers. This quirky little lady, she just said some things to me that kind of bounced around inside my soul. That on top of the fact that being my hometown, there's a lot of memories, most of which were not happy memories. But I realized that that trip became so much more about just going there to do some business. Somehow or another, I was being led on a journey, and I decided to participate fully. And so when Joey made the suggestion to write a memoir, even though I rejected that idea, I thought, well, I'll write some short stories about my friend, the gravedigger, or the flower shop lady. I'll just write some short stories about these interesting little interactions. Because I thought they were so nice. But then as I wrote those, I realized I needed to explain some of the backstory. And I started getting more and more content. And a few months into this process, I suddenly realized, in fact, I think I called up Joey. I said, "Joey, I think I'm writing a memoir." That's how it happened.
Yeah. Well, I really enjoyed rereading your memoir here leading up to our conversation today.
Thanks.
So the subtitle of your book is A Memoir of Family, Faith, and Forgiveness. So, as you began writing this book, what were some of the hopes you had, or maybe maybe this vision happened after you'd finished the book, but what were you hoping the reader would gain from this memoir?
Early on in the process, I was really confronted with the temptation to skew the truth a little bit.
Sure.
To tell a story that was a little more palatable or a little more popular.
Yeah.
And I just made the conscious decision I was going to tell the truth the best that I could. And at that point, I realized, and I actually talked to Joey, and I asked Joey, you might say I twisted his arm a little bit to be my editor on this project. And as I spoke to Joey about this, and I prayed about this, and I just had this sense in my heart that I needed to bring description and grace and find humor wherever I could and offer that to the reader. Because in the process of reading this book, they're going to be led down some very dark areas that in many ways, and for some people, would make them just want to close the book and throw it in a drawer and never look at it again. And I knew the end of the story was so good. And the end of the story was worth getting there. And then one day in my devotional time, as I was kind of unpacking this in my own thoughts and with my friend Jesus, I think Jesus said to me, love the reader, to love the reader. Mm-hmm. So my hope and really my commitment as a writer was to love the reader.
Yeah, I really like that way of saying it. It's easy to write a book for all kinds of reasons other than that. Yeah. To serve those who will give hours of their time to read words that you've written. Will this bless them? Will this help them?
Yes.
Will they experience the goodness of who God is through this story? So as you tell the story, as you said, there are a number of difficult truths about the journey you've been on, things that have happened. And part of your story is your mother's long journey with depression that ended sadly in her taking her own life when you were in your late 20s. And we're living in a time where suicide has been on the rise, since the pandemic began. I wonder what wisdom you could share with our listeners from your own experience about this huge challenge.
There's not a day goes by where I don't think about my mom. There's not.
That was a long time ago, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was.
Gosh.
Yeah, that was almost 40 years ago.
Yeah.
Which I can't explain the math considering I'm only 35.
That would involve time travel, I think.
Time travel, I think about her every day, and I cannot think about her without thinking about how her life ended. And there's no walking around or reframing or denying the sadness of it.
Yeah.
I don't have to do that anymore. I think for a long time, I just did everything I could not to think about it. Well, she was sick and, this and that, and it happens. And, that kind of thinking about it has actually led me to horrible results, a drinking problem and all kinds of problems with addiction.
Yeah.
Part of the ongoing recovery process for me is to look at my life and everything part of it, including my mother's suicide, and just let it be what it was.
Yeah.
I know this is that when someone does whatever they do to end their life, it's about ending pain, a pain that won't stop.
Yeah.
I can't speak for my mom, but I I am quite sure that her living experience was one with a complete absence of hope that her future might be better than what it was. She had lived in a horrible, painful, abusive marriage for decades. It had withered her health so badly that there was just, I don't think she saw any better way. And she'd had enough. I don't hold that against her. Sometimes we're asked the question, hey, if you could have lunch with anybody, who do you want to have lunch with? I would want to take my mom to a really nice place down by the beach, a really nice lunch, and give her some flowers and just have lunch with my mom. And so wisdom for others, I think I would encourage people not to be afraid of the reflection.
Yeah.
Bring the thoughts and the pain and the emotion and the confusion that comes along with all of this. And find some conversations where you can have some interaction and some discourse with others about this.
Yeah. I appreciate that. The way you described that, it made me think we can spend an enormous amount of time and energy avoiding our lives. Mm-hmm. And the way you've described the journey you've been on, life has come as you've embraced, at least acknowledged what actually is. This is my story. This has happened. And here I am. And how are you with me, God, in the middle of all of this? And with that, another element of your story, is growing up in a church-going family. You had a dad who played the organ every Sunday. He was Mr. Popular. But you experienced what sounds like a disconnect with a life of personal faith that didn't really come until later on as an adult. Can you talk about that experience some and what you learned?
Well, I had to learn the difference between an institutional religious training and a personal faith. And even when the teaching uses terms like your personal faith and this kind of thing, that doesn't necessarily mean that it is so.
Yeah.
I think the personal faith is one that comes with the journey, and it comes with finding our places in where, doggone it, I have to have a savior, and who is that going to be? And the savior is not something that is, shows up with the lapel pin or a tract in their hand or one of 10 Bible verses that they can, that they've memorized. I think the savior shows up wounded and bloodied and say, hey, you know what? I know the way out of here. Follow me. Early on in my salvation, I was confronted with these words. A counselor asked me, an addiction counselor asked me about my faith. So I give him, all the nuts and bolts. Well, Jesus, Son of God, he came and he lived, he died on the cross, he rose again. I put my faith in him. I go to heaven where the streets are paved with gold. My sins are forgiven. And he looks at me, he goes, He goes, you don't really believe that, do you? I said, of course I do. Of course I do. He goes, no, you don't believe that. And of course I was offended. And I said, how can you say that? He said, well, look at the way you live. I mean, for the way you live, you're a practical atheist, no matter what you say.
Oh, boy.
Wow.
Ouch.
Yeah. And that was really the grace of God speaking to me at that point. And I just began to ask a question, okay, God, who are you? You show me. So the experience of this religious experience, whatever you want to call it, spiritual awakening, whatever, went from being institutional or educational to being personal.
Yeah.
It's mine. Now I can share it with you. I can share it with people on this podcast. I can share it with the whole world. but it really has to do with me and Jesus.
Hmm. Yeah, there's something real that I remember you mentioning a transition where you began to hear what you thought, weren't sure what it was. I think you said it was your friend, the voice.
Yeah.
What was that like?
Well, not too long after this conversation with this counselor, I was scratching my head, and actually, he did me a favor in that. At that point, I kind of realized that what he said was true, and so I didn't know what else to do. But I just threw, kind of the baby out with the bathwater, and I said, "Okay, all right, okay." So I'm not. I guess I'm not a Christian. I don't know what I am, and I was reading a bunch of books. I read I read a Buddhist book, which actually I found helpful and interesting. I read all kinds of books. I read, New Age gurus and stuff. And then I came back and started reading the Bible. And I had some emotional negative reactions in reading scripture because it sounded to me like, the Sunday morning preacher, wagging his finger in my face. Yeah. But I said, God, whoever you are, if you don't help me, I'm going to die. I'll call you any name you want me to, Buddha, Muhammad, whatever. I just need to know you're there.
Yeah.
And I heard a voice that said, all right, David, now I can go to work. And Alan, you know what? That's all that I needed. I just knew that someone had answered my prayer, and that was the starting point for me. That was my equivalent of Jesus saying, follow me. And I began to follow that voice. For lack of a better understanding, I just said, well, that's my friend, the voice. I'm just following him. Over time, I began to realize that my friend, the voice, spoke from the heart of Jesus. And that's when I said, oh my goodness, I guess I'm a Christian. And I don't know, that's been 23 years ago. So here I am. So
I love that. So to me, that's the way that a testimony, which is just a way of telling the truth about, in this case, an encounter with God that came to you as a surprise in a way, even though you were asking. That's often how it happens. God is very good at surprising us, I think.
Yeah.
Well, so again, as we talk more about your story, a key part of your story has been your own experience of recovery, and then now your work in addiction recovery. I wonder if you can say a little bit more about that, and how does this story share that part of your journey?
Well, I learned early in recovery, the best way to help yourself was to help others. And without admitting it too publicly, I knew I needed a lot of help. So I thought, well, I should probably do as much as I could to help others. Kind of selfish, but it was a healthy selfish, I'll say.
Yeah.
And then that progressed. I was helping more and more people, and that was fine. I was giving a rise to meetings, sponsoring a few guys here and there, running a couple of meetings and helping out here and helping out there, and keeping actually quite busy. And then the recession of 2009 came along, and I found myself not being very busy with work. So I went back to school and got some credentialing done, spent a few years studying, and got a bunch of letters after my name, and went to work in the treatment center. So I learned kind of the institutional industrial side of the addiction treatment recovery world, and enjoyed that. But I also realized that at some point, I realized that wasn't the best use of my time and my talents. I've been writing and written a couple of books at that point, and I just have, in the years since, leaned more into the communications part. And I write a little bit about that in The Death of a Fisherman, not because it's an important part of that particular book, but it helps people understand kind of the continuity of timeline in this experience, from how I ended up being this man in the cemetery who my job is helping others. and I'm very good at my job at helping others, but I'm suddenly find myself here as a man who needs a lot of help. And I got to tell you, it's so much easier helping others than admitting that I need help.
Oh, yeah.
In fact, you know what? For my own sake, let me say again, it's so much easier helping others than admitting my need for help.
Yeah.
Interestingly enough, that's when the gravedigger showed up. And the flower shop lady shared with me what she shared, and some of these other people that just kind of came along who were not the kind of professionals or high credentialed people that we would normally look to for help, but they were of life-changing help to me. And I just continue to do that work, writing and speaking and helping out here and there.
Well, I imagine you're seeing what I'm seeing, which is to say that the dynamics of addiction and the prevalence of addiction has only increased in the last 2 or 3 years. I think as people are dealing with the pain, the discomfort, whatever of all that's been happening in our lives. I appreciated this about addiction. You said it's not a moral failure, not a failure of willpower, but it's a dysfunction of instinct that hijacks our ability to use our willpower in the best ways. And you also mentioned that addiction is often induced by trauma. Mm-hmm. Or if you could maybe say some more about that, because I think a lot of us can identify with some of those realities.
Well, let me just start by saying that the body of work and the clinical connections between trauma and addiction are actually quite well understood. And the body of work there is so large and so broad that, you can't even begin to talk about all the studies in a format like this, but there's no doubt. And when I talk about trauma, I'm talking about unhealed, I will even say unconnected trauma. Mm. In the long term, it's not the trauma that kills, it's the isolation and the loneliness. Mm. At whatever level a person thinks or feels that they're the one and only, that they have an element of their life or their history that no one will ever understand about, or that no one will ever understand or empathize with, and that they're stuck alone with that and that they can't share it.
Oh, man.
That's the toxic seed of addiction. Because that is this kind of small, I say small, but kind of this nuclear-powered pain inside the soul that is crying out to be medicated. So whether it's the drugs, the alcohol, and of course, we always think, well, the drugs and the alcohol and the pornography, and some people gambling. Okay, but what about workaholism? Mm-hmm. Workaholism is something generally people get patted on the back for. David's such a hard worker. Oh my gosh, he puts in 60 hours every week.
Oh yeah.
Codependency. Oh my goodness, they do so much for others, and they sacrifice so much. Or how about religious addiction? Mm-hmm. Where dogma is of greater value than relationship. Yeah. So trauma is the thing that cries out to be medicated, and then the ways that we medicate are the ways that we really begin to harm ourselves. That's addiction.
Yeah.
That is addiction. And it doesn't mean that we're bad people. Addiction can certainly lead us into doing things that are immoral.
Yeah.
But the very fact that it starts with addiction is not a moral failing in and of itself. There's not to be an alcoholic is not a tragedy. Mm. To be drunk, go wreck your car and hurt somebody, that is a tragedy. Mm. And it's the person that refuses to recognize their alcoholism, they're the ones that get in their car and they go hurt themselves or hurt somebody else. And by the way, I'll just say this, is that the bottom line bedrock of addiction is denial.
Mm.
It's not the behavior. The behavior is the expression. It's the denial that keeps someone blind to their own reality. It's the denial that keeps them minimizing or justifying. You know what? I'll just go do it one more time. Nobody knows. Mm-hmm. You know, look, it can't hurt my spouse if they don't know about it. Boy, when it comes to the gambling or the porn, that's what people say. Whether it's a husband or wife, if they don't know, how can it hurt them?
Right.
So,
well, as I listen to you, so that trauma, which I think most of us, if we reflect on our story, realize big T or little t, some form of trauma is back there, and maybe our habits of numbing or avoiding or escaping or denying, to use your language, that's the engine that keeps these addictive dynamics going.
Right.
And man, you can sure waste an enormous amount of life avoiding something that could be addressed.
Absolutely. But I think this is really the redemptive, God's gracious power, is the fact that no matter how, and I tell people this in who I work with, is that time lost to active addiction, that's been the training ground. That's been the area. If you try to ignore that or just kind of put it in the rearview mirror and never look at it again, it will have no future value to you. But if you reflect on it and bring it into a community conversation with other people who can understand, that begins the place where we realize how much of an appetite for goodness that we have developed. And how much hunger we had. Let's don't ever ignore, try to deny the positive value of hunger. It compels us forward to something good.
Yeah. Well, I really appreciate that. I know there are just a number of recovery lines that I've gone back to that have proven to be, sometimes they sound very simple and sort of homesy, but one of them that I've remembered many times is the idea that God will do for us what we can't do for ourselves. But you also suggest that God won't do for us what only we can do for ourselves. I wonder if you can talk about that dynamic a little bit.
I think healing and moving forward in life is this divine interaction between God's grace and our actions, between God's benevolent opportunities and the path that he lays out, and the choices and the actions that we take. The whole world knows that I'm a recovering alcoholic. The whole world knows that I'm a recovering drug addict and that I grew up looking at my father's porn. So pornography was something that fueled both my alcohol and my drug use. I had to look at all those things in recovery. And God never came down and knocked the beer out of my hand. Sometime after calling my drug dealer on the way to his house, God never just made my drug dealer die of a heart attack. He would be there when,
Yeah.
But God did provide some other measures to get my attention. This is where, and at some point we have to make the decision of what are we going to do with the consequence of our actions, be it good or bad.
Yeah.
And so, God does not remove our ability to make choices. He won't do that because he didn't create robots.
Right.
So I know for me is that here's something that I reflect on that's really helpful for me to remember. Several years before I sobered up, a friend of mine in my community would call me up and say, "Hey, why don't you come go to a 12-step meeting with me?" And I would say, "Why?" "Well, because, hey, we're going to have this thing. It's going to be a bar." And I'd be like, he sounded like the missionary that knocking on my door invited me to church. Like, okay, I didn't want to do that. Then I got in trouble for drugs. And they said, you have to go to 12-step meetings. I run across this guy at the 12-step meetings. Of course, he's very understanding, very compassionate. He'd been down a very similar road. And when I saw him there, I started to realize, oh my gosh, I didn't have to wait this long. God was already, he was pitching. I was not catching. I wasn't even on the ball field.
Yeah.
So, God's grace does not eliminate me of my responsibility to follow.
Yeah. I mean, it sounds like, in part, growing in grace, to use a phrase from Paul, well, and Peter for that matter, is an active thing on my side. Learning how to cooperate with God's gracious initiative, learning how to say yes to what he's inviting me to, rather than ignoring what he's inviting me to, or just saying, my subtle no's to what he's saying.
Well, and because of the religious way I grew up, I had the sense that if ever I did wrong, God was getting a little PO'd with me. And of course, if he's PO'd with me, the last person I want to go to is someone who's PO'd at me.
Of course.
And then I'd get myself into a little bit more trouble and be a little bit more PO'd, and I'd get myself a little bit more trouble and he'd be a little bit more upset. So this widening gap between the two of us in spiritual reality is getting wider and wider and wider. And yet none of this was God's fault. It really was the result of me having these kind of indoctrinated misunderstanding of God.
Yeah.
I didn't realize that God was there the whole time just going, hey, turn around, I'm here. Turn around, I'm here with open arms. I'm here to help. I'm here to care for you. That's where my friend, the voice, showed up and helped you to understand.
Yeah. It was a very different, the tone of that voice as you report some of the ways you heard what, God speaking to you. It was a very different tone than that sort of disappointed, arms crossed, eye rolling, head shaking. I mean, it sounds like a voice of grace. It sounds like a voice of love. It sounds like a voice that's been there all along, just waiting for you to turn your head a few degrees to notice. I think there's a beauty in that. And so continuing, one of the sentences I underlined in your book, which I really appreciated, was just this: the pain of my past experiences will never change until I change the way I see it. I wonder if you could describe what that means in your own journey.
Well, in my own journey, I was frequently revisited by memories that I didn't want to remember. And they would just pop up out of nowhere under any situation, driving down the road, whatever I might be doing. And I was like, it was almost like I wanted to retroactively go back in time and remove that 24 hours or that month or that week, remove that experience from the reality of history like it never existed.
Yeah.
When I came to realize that, as long as I keep trying to avoid it, deny it, or somehow to try to retroactively go back and change it through, kind of playing with the facts in my own memory, it was never going to change, and it would be haunting me.
Yeah.
But when I just said, okay, it was what it was. How can I learn to think about this differently? How can this thing from the past that has haunted me be something that will that it will be part of my life going forward, where it no longer haunts me, but it helps me.
Yeah.
That included things like the night of my mother's suicide. And I write in the book, I'm not going to tell the story because I want the reader to read it. It's written much better than I can tell it, but it was a gory scene, bloody. And I'll never forget it. I don't need to forget it now.
Yeah.
Something about the acceptance of it and just let it be what it was, and making peace with the horror of it has helped me to understand, you know what? I'm stronger than I ever realized. As long as I thought it haunted me, it was the boogeyman under the bed that would make me run screaming make me run screaming.
Yeah.
But when I would be willing to open up the closets and look under the bed and say, okay, you know what? I'm not afraid of you anymore. And I'm going to look at you. I'm going to look you right square in the eye. That's when that ghost under the bed it evaporated.
Yeah.
Didn't change any of the facts, but it changed my relationship with the facts.
Yeah. So you weren't changing history, but you were coming to see things from a different vantage point.
Right.
To me, this is a little bit of what the New Testament language of redemption is about, that God can take that which is ugly and awful and painful, and somehow God can actually, through it and in me, do something that's actually good.
Right. Right.
That's not just nice religious language. It's actually a living dynamic. Right.
Well, I think one of the gifts, the way God is revealing himself through kind of the fellowship and the culture in the recovery community, is help people understand that it's, we don't have to go back and fix the past. We don't have to fix the past in order to have a decent future. That doesn't mean we don't have amends to make, doesn't mean we don't have consequences to address. But there are some things in the past we just have to say they are what they are. And let's move forward. And then watch how God's grace not only helps us in today, but he builds a future for us, and also how he goes back and redeems that, which was so horrible about the past, so that it now provides a vision and helpful building blocks for the future. That's when those things truly do become a teaching and training ground.
Yeah.
I know this is that after my mother's suicide, I went off the deep end with drinking and the drugs not too long after that, which led to about 15 years of drug and alcohol addiction, during which the time I was actually quite functional. Had a nice home, a couple of nice cars, going to, somehow or another, I was somehow able to pull that off. What I didn't understand is how to go back and to deal with that. That was the key that opened up the door for a healthy future going forward. And and again, that's part of the recovery journey. The part of the recovery journey is we go back and we do the best we can to look at our life in the past and to bring that into some conversation and some community. And that's how we begin to find the stepping stones to move forward. Not that we leave these things in the past, but so we understand the right place for them in the past. And for me, I think one of the things I'm so grateful for is that, so if someone contacts me now and says, you know what, recently I just had a young man from New Hampshire reach out to me whose mother had committed suicide.
Oh boy.
And as I was talking with him and we were working through it, I realized, oh my gosh, I'm so grateful for this. I'm so grateful. I'm so sorry for his mom.
Yeah.
And I'm so sorry for his dad. And for all the people hurt by this. But I was grateful for my own experience because I could do something for him that I could never have done otherwise.
Yeah. And that someone without your journey wouldn't be able to do with the integrity and actual grace that you're able to do it with.
Yeah, you don't learn that in a classroom.
No. People really need actual lived grace.
Yeah.
They don't need to read about grace in a book or hear about grace in a sermon. That's good. That's perfectly good.
Right.
But at some point, it's got to become a part of someone's life and then be shared in that form,
right?
I think, with others.
Right.
So you and I are both authors, and I know that each book I've written has given me a gift. It's given me a gift before it gave anyone who read the book a gift. I guess I'm wondering what perhaps has been God's gift to you having written this memoir?
Well, wow, what a great question. Two answers come to mind. Well, first of all, the readers. The reviews I've seen, and I've had a few people who I've connected with by email or somehow or another who've read the book. I'm so grateful for them.
Oh.
And the conversations and what they've shared with me is how they're empowered to basically go tell their own story and really to face their own story and to make friends with their own life.
Yep.
That's the first thing. The second thing is, now, this is a little personal. I never thought I'd tell this to anybody. And here I'm telling it to you on a podcast.
Oh, boy.
Stop me right now before I stop me. Tell me to shut up.
Don't do it. Don't do
it. So as Joey and I are wrapping up the last of the edits, Joey O'Connor, who you know, prolific writer.
Yeah.
And he's one of my dearest friends. I said, Joey, you know, if the book never gets into print, I want to say thank you. The writing it was about a 2.5 year process. I didn't work on it every day, but but it was about 2.5 year process. And I said, I am so fortunate, and I'm so glad to have written this book. I got a glimpse of the beautiful ending of my horrid life. And I brought tears to my eyes as I was telling this Joey. I just started to weep, and I wanted to thank him, and I wanted to thank God, because and in fact, those words. This is how I write: is I find myself saying something, and I go, "Oh, I should write that down." I saw a glimpse of the beautiful ending of my horrid life. And so that was the gift for me.
That's remarkable. I think the gift of a book like yours, where you have reflected on places of pain, places of wounding, places of things you've done that you wish you hadn't done, or things you didn't do that you wish you had done. The fact is, all of us have places like this in our journeys, and we don't realize that those could be the very places where we could experience the very real grace and mercy and affection and delight and care of God.
Right. Exactly. These are things we've heard. If you grew up in church like I did, you've heard these words preached to you your entire life. And every one of them is true. Listen, it's those of us who grew up having sad, heartbroken experiences with church. It's generally not because we were given the wrong information. There is an inevitable personal journey that is required for any of that to ever make sense.
Yeah.
And no one can do that for us but us. We have to go live our lives. That's the putting one foot in front of the other, one day at a time, getting up, going to work, interacting with our families, our lives, doing some good, making some bad mistakes, this and that. And somehow or another, through that, we come to a point where we go, man, I am way in over my head. I can never solve my problems. I can never fix my mistakes. Oh God, if you don't help me, I'm going to die. And that's the moment that all of those words can begin to make sense.
Yeah. Well, as we close our conversation about your book, I wonder if you could just share a word of encouragement to our listeners, kind of in the spirit of what you've written, maybe extending an invitation to them in the spirit of this memoir.
Well, thank you for that. And I would just say that don't begrudge your life. Don't make a judgment about it. There's some good, there's some bad. And the ending is not finished. And God will give you the good ending if you let him. And that's not always an easy thing to do. I think the way through that is the way there's often discomfort. And we have to work our way through some discouragement. I think my greatest encouragement for people is to get with people who can understand. And people who are not quick to give you answers for your questions, but someone who will sit with you in the unknowing. And even possibly share the same questions and say, you know what, why don't we sit here together while God shows us what we need to know?
Well, those are good words. I so appreciate it. Listeners, I hope you'll get yourself a copy of David's book, Death of a Fisherman. Again, my guest has been David Zailer. And Dave, it's just been a great conversation today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, listeners, and give my best to Jim. All right.
I'll do it. Thanks.
All right. Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed our conversation as much as I did. In the next few episodes, we'll be talking with authors Tyler Staton and Sean Nemechek. I can't wait to share those with you. If you'd like to receive more help from Unhurried Living, I invite you to join our Unhurried daily email list. For 40 days, we'll send you a brief daily email that offers personal reflections from life and Scripture to help you take the next step in following Jesus' unhurried way. You can sign up on our website at unhurriedliving.com. We're honored to encourage thousands of leaders just like you. Thanks for listening. You've been listening to the Unhurried Living podcast. Join us next time to learn more about following the genius of Jesus' unhurried way of life and leadership.